Imagine sitting in a military trench inside a deep dirt trench. The air is cold and crisp. A morning in September. You're a young man of 20, exactly 20 years old, wearing a standard military uniform made of basic cotton fabric. You have been informed that this is just a routine, a standard military training exercise, just another ordinary day waiting in the muddy dirt without any warning. Suddenly the sky violently tears open, a blinding, massive flash, much brighter than 1,000 exploding suns. It instantly blinds your vision, even when looking through tightly closed and shut eyelids. An overwhelming wave of heat violently washes over your face. The heat is so intense that it literally feels like the surrounding air itself has completely caught fire. The solid ground beneath you violently heaves and shakes, physically tossing your body like a helpless rag doll. Massive trees, thick oaks that have stood there for hundreds of centuries, are violently snapped in half like brittle dry spaghetti. And then comes the sound, a deafening world-ending roar. You look up into the sky. Rising high into the stratosphere is a boiling, monstrous mushroom cloud. But here is the single detail that breaks all human logic. The warning sirens begin to wail loudly, and the chilling command echoes through the military radio. Attack! Forward, directly into the epicenter. You probably think this is a fictional scene from a dystopian sci-fi movie, or maybe some alternate history timeline where the Cold War went completely hot. But this terrifying event is not fiction. This actually happened in reality on September 14th, 1954. And the victims of this brutal nuclear strike weren't the foreign enemy. They were 45,000 loyal Soviet soldiers, the very same victorious army that had defeated Nazi Germany less than a decade earlier. And the man giving the order to march directly into the radioactive inferno was none other than the legendary military hero, Marshal Georgy Zhukov. You think nuclear weapons were only tested on abandoned wooden houses, plastic mannequins, and unfortunate livestock. You think the devastating horrors of radiation were discovered entirely by accident. No, the most cynical and brutal military experiment in the entire history of the Cold War was purposefully conducted by a government on its very own people. They used living, breathing, victorious soldiers as disposable biological radiation sensors. But why? Why would any nation deliberately burn its own army in a nuclear fire? Today, we are going to figure out how severe geopolitical paranoia drove a legendary military commander to nuke his own troops. We will explore the terrifying biological physics of what exactly happens to a human body when it inhales vaporized radioactive plutonium, mistakenly thinking it's just ordinary dust. We will uncover the massive state-sponsored medical cover-up that systematically erased a radioactive epidemic for decades, and ultimately, we will see why the Cold War wasn't cold at all. It was a real physical war where the superpowers simply fought and destroyed their own populations. Let's rewind the clock back to 1954. The world was gripped by a brand new kind of geopolitical madness. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a tense staring contest, each superpower holding a loaded nuclear gun to the other's head. But there was a massive problem. The guns weren't equal in power. The US had a massive technological head start in nuclear weaponry and a strict military doctrine of, quote, zero. They had the strategic bombers, the military bases, and the bombs to turn the Soviet Union into a glass parking lot. The Soviet leadership was utterly terrified. Therefore, they desperately needed to prove that the Red Army wouldn't just evaporate in the event of a nuclear strike. They needed to show the West that even if you dropped the atomic bomb on them, their tanks would simply roll right through the radioactive crater and keep driving all the way to the English Channel. It was a high-stakes geopolitical poker game. But to bluff convincingly on the world stage, you need hard data. Generals are strategic planners. They like organized tables, charts, and complete predictability. But what actually happens to a heavy T-54 tank when a 40-kiloton nuclear weapon detonates directly above it? Does the heavy metal engine melt completely? Does the tank crew instantly go blind from the flash? Can infantry still operate their standard rifles? Or will the electromagnetic pulse and blast wave render the entire battalion useless? Nobody actually knew the answer. You simply cannot calculate human panic on a classroom chalkboard. Therefore, the military brass decided they needed a live-action rehearsal. They chose the remote Tutskoye training ground in the Chkalov region, what is known today as Orenburg. Why choose that specific location? Because the natural terrain, gentle hills, scattered forests, and rivers, perfectly mimicked the landscape of Western Europe, exactly where the theoretical World War III was supposed to be fought. The secret operation was given a cynically innocent code name, Snehawk, which translates to snowball. In the tense weeks leading up to the test, 45,000 troops were moved to the polygon. They dug thousands of kilometers of deep trenches, built hundreds of reinforced concrete bunkers, and carefully positioned thousands of heavy artillery pieces and tanks. They even tied live animals, horses, sheep, and dogs, to wooden posts, positioned at varying distances from ground zero to see exactly how fast flesh would cook. But the human soldiers themselves were kept completely in the dark. They knew a highly special weapon would be used that day, but the word nuclear was heavily censored and banned. They were handed standard issue gas masks and thin paper capes for protection. The military commanders treated the impending deadly radiation the way you might treat a bad sunburn. The military logic was terrifyingly simple. If you just wear your gas mask and don't eat the dirt, you'll be perfectly fine. This brings us directly to a crucial, fatal flaw in human psychology. When an authoritative figure, especially one wearing the shining gold stars of a marshal, tells you that a flimsy piece of paper and a rubber mask will protect you from the power of a shattered atom, you blindly believe them because the terrifying alternative is simply too horrifying to comprehend. At exactly 9:33 a.m., a heavy 2-4 bomber approached the target area. Inside its metal belly was the deadly RDS-4 bomb, affectionately nicknamed Tatiana by the military. Tatiana was certainly not a small firecracker. She packed a devastating yield of 40 kilotons. That is more than twice the destructive power of the atomic bomb that annihilated Nagasaki. The bomb was finally dropped from the plane. It fell silently through the air for exactly 45 seconds. It detonated precisely at an altitude of 350 meters above the ground. Why an airburst instead of a ground explosion? Because detonating a nuclear bomb in the air maximizes the destructive reach of the blast wave. It acts exactly like a giant, invisible hammer violently slamming down on the earth, crushing concrete buildings and completely sweeping away thick forests over a much wider radius. The massive explosion created a blinding fireball that instantly vaporized the central target area. The core temperature reached tens of millions of degrees in a microsecond. The sand below didn't just passively burn, it melted completely, turning into a smooth, highly radioactive glass crust. The shockwave violently radiated outward at supersonic speed, instantly collapsing defensive trenches and burying the tethered animals completely alive. Then, a terrifying, eerie silence fell over the polygon. But it wasn't the end of the nightmare. It was just the signal. Less than 3 short hours after the nuclear detonation, the order was given. The artillery began a massive barrage, simulating a breakthrough of enemy lines. And then, the unstoppable human wave began. Tens of thousands of young men obediently climbed out of their trenches. Heavy tanks loudly revved their diesel engines, and they marched in unison, straight toward the smoking, highly radioactive epicenter of the blast. Let's pause right here and drop down the cognitive ladder of abstraction. What does it actually physically mean to walk into a nuclear epicenter 3 hours after a blast? You cannot see invisible radiation with your eyes. You cannot smell it in the air. You can't taste it. The soldiers were marching through a thick, choking cloud of dust, kicked up by the explosion and the tanks. The commanders had told them to put on their gas masks, but the late summer heat was brutal. Inside a rubber mask, a soldier begins to suffocate within minutes. Therefore, many simply pulled the masks off to catch their breath. They wiped the sweat from their faces with bare, dust-covered hands. That dust was not just dirt, it was radioactive fallout. It contained isotopes like strontium-90 and cesium-137. When you inhale a microscopic particle of radioactive dust, it lodges deep inside your lung tissue. From the outside, you look fine, you feel fine, but on a microscopic level, an execution has begun. Imagine your DNA as an incredibly complex, beautifully written instruction manual for keeping you alive. Every cell in your body relies on this book. Now, imagine a billion microscopic shrapnel grenades exploding inside the library where that book is kept. That is what ionizing radiation does. Alpha and beta particles tear through your cells like cannonballs, smashing the double helix of your DNA. Your cells try to repair the damage, but the code is scrambled. Letters are missing, paragraphs are reversed. The cell forgets how to function. It forgets how to die naturally. It begins to multiply uncontrollably, or it simply rots from the inside out. These young men, laughing, smoking, and brushing the glowing dust off their uniforms, were already dead. They just didn't know it yet. The RPE, the reward prediction error of their biology, was entirely bypassed. Their senses told them they had survived the ultimate weapon. Their biology was already collapsing. The exercise ended. Marshal Zhukov observed from a secure lead-line bunker miles away. He was reportedly very pleased. The troops had maintained formation. The tanks had driven through the crater. The Soviet Union had proven its point to Washington. We can survive the apocalypse. The troops were given a hearty meal, a shot of vodka, and the thanks of the motherland. Then they were handed a piece of paper, a non-disclosure agreement. They were forced to sign a vow of silence lasting 25 years. They were forbidden from telling anyone, not their wives, not their parents, not even their doctors, where they had been or what they had seen. And then the invisible time bomb went off. A few years later, the young men who had stormed the Totskoye polygon began to fall ill. It started with chronic fatigue, strange rashes, and sudden tooth loss. Then came the severe diagnoses: leukemia, thyroid cancer, massive gastrointestinal hemorrhaging. But they couldn't explain why. When a 25-year-old veteran went to a civilian hospital coughing up blood, the doctors were baffled. And here is where the state committed its second, far more insidious crime. The KGB issued secret directives to medical institutions. It was strictly forbidden to diagnose these men with, quote, 5. The system had to protect itself. Admitting that tens of thousands of soldiers were dying of radiation meant admitting that the great Soviet leadership had mass murdered its own heroes. Therefore, the doctors lied. They wrote anything they could think of in the medical records: vegetative vascular dystonia, gastric ulcer, severe acute respiratory infection. Because their medical records were falsified, these dying men were denied specialized treatment. They were denied disability pensions. They were stripped of their benefits and left to rot in absolute obscurity. They watched their bodies disintegrate, knowing exactly what was killing them, but completely legally silenced from speaking the truth. This wasn't just a military experiment gone wrong. It was a perfectly executed erasure of human lives. Out of the 45,000 soldiers who participated in the Totskoye exercises, only a tiny fraction survived long enough to see the collapse of the Soviet Union and the lifting of the secrecy. The vast majority died in their 30s and 40s. Their graves are scattered across the former empire, unmarked by the true cause of their death. Georgy Zhukov, the man who ordered the march, went on to receive more medals and secure his place in the pantheon of military legends. The Totskoye polygon became a silent, contaminated zone, conveniently scrubbed from the official history books for decades. We often talk about the Cold War as a period of relative peace, a time when mutual assured destruction kept the superpowers from pulling the trigger. We call it cold, because the great armies never clashed directly on the battlefield. But that is a comfortable illusion. The Cold War was not cold. It was a raging, physical conflict. It's just that the United States and the Soviet Union didn't drop bombs on each other. They dropped them on themselves. They radiated their own deserts, their own islands and their own citizens. The nuclear shield that defined the second half of the 20th century was forged directly out of the bones of the people it was supposedly designed to protect. The tragedy of the Totskoye polygon forces us to confront a terrifying reality about the nature of power. An external enemy might want to conquer you, but a bureaucracy driven by paranoia and metrics will gladly sacrifice you without a second thought and then classify your death as a state secret. The 45,000 men at Totskoye didn't die for their country. They died for a data point on a general's clipboard.